Disney's live-action remake of Snow White, starring Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot, comes out in just a few days. And Disney ought to be really worried about some of these projections now for the global opening weekend. Because in the ongoing case of the Walt Disney Company versus literally anything better to do, audiences are siding with literally anything better to do. Our expectations were low, but holy shit. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many watching this video not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. $100 million global opening. This is what Anthony D'Alessandro and Nancy Tartaglione at Deadline Magazine are pegging Snow White's debut at this weekend over the 3 days. And let me tell you something, this is terrifying. And maybe if we're lucky, we'll hear this come up on the annual shareholder meeting that the Walt Disney Company is hosting just roughly 2 days from now as we release this video on Tuesday, March 18th. We'll be covering that annual shareholder meeting live, of course, right here on the Renegade Nation, as we always do. Make sure you join us for that one. But let's talk about how bad these numbers really are. Disney's feature take on the classic 1937 tune Snow White, you know, the one that actually really started and launched Walt's movie career, the biggest Disney princess, most celebrated Disney princess that Disney has ever had for nearly 100 years, finally is hitting theaters this weekend after weathering tormenting, blown out of proportion tabloid controversy. I think we've debated that one to death, and yeah, I don't think it was blown out of proportion at all. The only thing blown out of proportion apparently was Rachel's own mouth. Domestic is looking to land at a $45 to $50 million opening, which in and of itself is atrocious. But only another $55 million coming from overseas markets. Now, one of the things I've been cautious about with this film before I made any final prognostications as to its ultimate box office was to see exactly how this international would play out. And until today, we really did not have a good beat on it from any reliable source. And Deadline has been one of the most reliable in the past for being pretty spot on almost every time. Certainly there can be some surprises either way going higher or lower. But when Nancy Tartaglione tells me that she's only seeing about $50 to $55 million around the world outside of North America for this movie, well, then now I think we finally know where we're going to land. But before you get your hopes up based on some recent Disney entries, let's talk about how these things are not the same. Back around the Thanksgiving frame of 2024, Moana 2 opened up with $389 million globally, and that was the biggest ever for an animated worldwide opening. Now, of course, we had some school holidays in there with Thanksgiving, but nothing very extended, nothing like a Christmas break or even summer. And of course, Snow White is not really enjoying much of any kind of break going on right now, except for a very small portion of the country that may be on spring break or Easter break over the next week. The rest of that spring and Easter break doesn't happen for about another 2 to 3 weeks for most places. Starting with $389 million, Moana 2 finished up at over $1 billion internationally and domestically combined. A great worldwide haul, something that we said early on that Moana 2 should be able to do. There was some concern in the beginning because it slowed down quite a bit after that opening weekend, but it just kept trucking along. But if you look at the breakdown between Moana's box office, $460 million domestic, $597, almost $600 million international, you get a rough idea that it leaned more heavily to the international over its run and did just fine. But then around Christmas, Disney kind of hit the skids on this one. $122 million global start, less than a third of what Moana 2 did just a few weeks earlier. But even Mufasa, which opened over the Christmas break, and that's key because an opening weekend isn't nearly as loaded over a Christmas break as it is, say, on March 21st, like Snow White is opening, because kids and families will stretch out their movie going over the next 1 to 2 weeks while school is out. It's a very, very different dynamic. And over time, Mufasa surprisingly performed on a global basis fairly well. But I want you to pay attention here. Mufasa only came up with about $250 million in the domestic box office. Now, that's not a terrible number in and of itself. Of course, this was a fairly large budgeted film with more than $200 million spent to produce it, and probably another 100 to 125 or maybe even more million dollars to market this sucker. But look at where the bulk of the box office came from here for Mufasa. It legged out to over $700 million, almost entirely thanks to the international box office, not really here domestically. Basically, almost 2-to-1 international versus domestic. But in the case of Snow White, which didn't have an extremely popular lead-in from Disney Plus like Moana 2 did, or it didn't have the benefit of a Thanksgiving or even a bigger Christmas holiday frame like Mufasa and Moana 2 did, and it doesn't appear to have any advantage whatsoever in the international market, because right now the projections show that the domestic and international markets for Snow White are almost dead even. The problem there, of course, is that where does it really leg out from here? If the international box office isn't going to outperform for Snow White like it did for Mufasa, then this movie has nowhere to run to. And with a massive production budget, thanks to overproduction in the case of Disney, and frankly, just bad management on the case of Disney when it comes to these productions and not controlling costs like most other studios try to do. Of course, there was some reshoots going on, delay for a year on this film. We're looking at a movie that's probably going to clock in somewhere around $400 million in gross production costs before any things like film tax credits are calculated in. Even if the film tax credits bring the production cost down to closer to $300 million, that still doesn't include a $100+ million, if not $150 million global marketing campaign from the Walt Disney Company. And yes, they're still going to spend it even if they don't invite any press onto the red carpet to interview the two stars out of fear that Rachel Ziegler might say something else that was stupid. Because as I remind people, even this article is quoting an incomplete figure, $270 million feature production. That number comes from the actual financial reports that Disney filed in the UK in order to get its film tax credits. Because we have them right here. We've discussed them live on air before. And thanks to our friend Caroline Reed out there at Forbes magazine for doing her diligent work to find all of these entities. But one thing I want to remind people again is right up there at the top for the period ended 31st December 2023. That's right. That cumulative $270 million production figure is only up through about 15 months ago now. How much more work has been done on this movie since it was delayed all through 2024 and up to this point in 2025? There's probably at least another $100 to $150 million that has not been reported yet, but when it is, believe me, you'll hear it from us first. With a miserable global opening like this, I don't expect it to perform as poorly as, say, Captain Falcon DEI or Captain America Brave New World did. Marvel audiences and superhero audiences tend to perform and behave very differently than those of, say, children and family audiences. Those audiences tend to be very heavily front-loaded. So by the time you get about a week into a Marvel movie, probably half or better of your box office is almost completely baked in. Whereas with Snow White, Moana, and yes, even Mufasa, you see those family audiences stretch out a little bit more over time. That's not going to be that uncommon. So a $100 million global start, hey, it'd be lucky to see a 4X set of legs, meaning that if it is that lucky, this movie may wind up around $400 million in total global box. But then again, it could continue to leg from there if it gets good word of mouth, maybe seeing 500 or 600 million. But I somehow doubt that it's going to be able to beat The Little Mermaid in 2023, which, at least in current culture for the last several decades, was a much more popular, more well-known, and frankly, a bigger merchandise hit Disney princess than Snow White has been. But all of that guesswork gets down to a point of profitability. Because unless this Snow White movie starring Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot actually hits somewhere at least around $800 million in the global box office, Disney is absolutely taking a loss on this one. At this point, it's just a question of how big. The Little Mermaid starring Halle Bailey finished up under $600 million. Yeah, that movie actually lost money based on what they spent to produce it and market it. I don't know if Snow White is going to be able to top that. My estimation is it's going to come well behind, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below and tell me what you think of this estimate for Snow White's opening weekend and what you think it's going to wind up doing after its full run. Until then, take care. We'll see you on the next live show every Sunday and Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget the special live show on Thursday at noon Central or 1 p.m. Eastern for the Walt Disney Company annual shareholder meeting. Take care. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.